Congratulations on a remarkable film. Could you talk a little bit about the journey that took this story from real life and the headlines to becoming this wonderful documentary film?
Well, it's a story 200 years in the making, to be honest with you, so we can start back there. But for me personally, I'd been brought up in Australia as an Indigenous person, living in our communities, which would be akin to First Nations reservations here. Then I lived overseas for a very long time. I was a correspondent for CNN and covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We lived in China, we lived in the Middle East. We arrived back in Australia right at the beginning of what Adam had gone through. And it was shocking to come back to a country that, in many people's eyes, is the envy of the world, and to see that there are still these entrenched issues of the legacy of our history, the ongoing struggle for human rights and civil rights of First Nations people, and the prevailing racism that still exists in a country like Australia. So I wrote about that and spoke about that, and that gathered momentum. Eventually I'd written a book, and the idea of the film began to grow, not just as a film that captured Adam's struggle, but as something that placed Adam's story within the broader context of Australia's history. And the struggle of Indigenous people in Australia today, who still are not recognised in our constitution. We still have never signed treaties with First Nations people in Australia. We still die 10 years younger than the average Australian. We have the worst health and housing and employment and education statistics. We are fewer than 3% of the population, and we are at least a quarter of the prison population. More than that when it comes to juvenile detention. And in one particular part of Australia, the Northern Territory, we are 97% of those behind bars. So this story of Adam deserved a bigger canvas to place that in a bigger context of Australia's history and ask hard questions about issues of reconciliation and rights.
Daniel, can you talk a little bit about what drew you to this project and how you came to be engaged with it?
I mean, I profess a huge ignorance of the story and of Adam even and his career. But I was introduced to it through John Batzik, who's in the room somewhere, I think, and Sarah Thompson, producing partner. And it was really a, do we think this is a story that could be one of our films? And John and I have made 20 films together. And I felt instinctively it was. But the more we got into the research, the more we realised this is a film that's bigger than just, when I say just, Adam's story. It's a film that talks to a lot of things that we're very ignorant about outside of Australia, but even within Australia. There's an awful lot that I didn't know. It was a learning journey for me as well.
And Tracy, can you speak about why it was important for you as a journalist to appear in the film?
It wasn't important for me to appear in the film. It's just that I've got a lot to say.
That's important. That's important.
I've been covering sport and international sport for a few decades now, and I've always been really interested in what sport says about the environment it's played in, who's playing it, who's controlling it, who's saying what are the images, what are the messages, what are we seeing happening on a sports field that tells us so much more about the country and the globe that we live in. And so Adam's story in Australia is the same as the Colin Kaepernick story here. Or if you want to go back in time, it's like the Black Power salute in 1968 with Tommy Smith and John Carlos. I mean, there's any number of analogies you can draw from right around the world. It's that sort of a story. And to sit and observe what was happening to Adam in a country where most people would have no idea what Adam was going through and what led to that point, but they joined in on this sort of bandwagon campaign of abuse. It's kind of heart-wrenching. And I think a lot of people don't know that I'm also Stan's wife, and we have 3 children. And so, you know, this is also very important because our children are the next generation, just as Adam has, you know, his baby daughter here. And we want the future of Australia to be better. I think we can all learn from each other.
Adam, how do you see this film? Is it as a tool for the work that you've been doing the last few years?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think when Stan called me up and said I need to meet these guys from the UK that want to tell a story And it's not my story, it's not Stan's story, it's our story as Australians. And I was very open to it. I know what happened to me. I wasn't know if I was ready to talk about or even take myself back to those final years of, what had happened. But after meeting the team to talk about what we could do with this film, and to be sitting here in Toronto at the film festival now, this is exactly where we wanted to be, to tell that message, to share our stories as Indigenous people. We pass on our history through stories, and this is a great way that we can share those stories. And for my baby daughter Adelaide, who's only 12 weeks old, but for her to one day look back and that this is what Dad was standing up for, and this is what Stan and other Aboriginal leaders were standing up for. You want them to be proud, but you also then want them to see what's happened since the movie's dropped, people have watched it, and then the conversations that continue to happen afterwards.
The title, The Australian Dream, has multifaceted and many layers of meanings. I wonder what you want that to mean to audiences who will be viewing the film.
The Australian Dream, it's an oft-used phrase in Australia, and what it really represents, I think, is a new beginning. For many people, the Australian Dream is to come, start again, build your family, live in this remarkably peaceful, cohesive, incredibly prosperous country. And yet for us, as First Nations people, we paid a price for all of that. And we don't have the option of leaving our history behind because we live with our history every day. A civilization that is 60,000 plus years old, the oldest continuous living civilization on Earth. And that we are connected through our stories, we are connected through our ancestry to this place, but we are also estranged from that place, having our lands invaded and stolen, being segregated, pushed onto reservations and living on the margins of this remarkable country. So the Australian Dream really is this idea of what Australia could be, set against that sense that we can never really attain that until we have fully recognised the place of First People.
Do you feel strides have been made in the last 5 years towards this dream?
That's an interesting question, because if you measure it on, what the government calls closing the gap report, which we have, no, we're not making any strides. I think when it comes to health outcomes, educational outcomes, employment outcomes, the one area where I am seeing a lot of, prosperous opportunities is in the entrepreneurial space, where Indigenous people are starting their own businesses. The government started an Indigenous procurement policy only 3 years ago, forcing government agencies to procure with Indigenous businesses. That's because of good policy. Now, if you go back 12 months when they didn't have to procure with Indigenous businesses, they only did $6 million procurement with those. So that's grown over the last 3 years to over $1 billion being filtered through Indigenous businesses now. So that for me is a real highlight. That's only going to get bigger and better as the Indigenous businesses build their capability. Every person that's come to Australia, non-Indigenous, have been able to, in 1 or 2 generations, lift their standards of living. Indigenous people, we've only been able to vote in the last 50 years. We've only been able to get a home loan from the bank in the last 50 years. So we're just starting to build that education, to build that wealth in our communities. We need to keep telling stories like the Australian Dream from an Indigenous perspective, because that's the only way, hopefully, that we can get people to listen to our stories.
Daniel, can you talk a little bit about how you chose the narrative arc of the film?
Well, it looks really nice now, doesn't it? It looks almost like perfect.
Gorgeous.
Oh, it was bound to be made like that. And the editing process was just a difficult process, because you're trying to find the story within the edit. And initially, it would start off being very Adam-centric, actually. And then as we brought more characters in, then when we filmed more interviews, and then it grew. And I have to mention the editor, Matt Wiley, who edited a film with me 3 years ago called The Fall, who did a fantastic job, really, really fantastic job. And again, he's an outsider, and he's looking at all these interviews. And the thing that we both agreed on was that it had to be told from their perspective. It's never from our perspective. Yeah. But we had a huge amount of material and archive, and it's just trying to select what's going to be most impactful.
Can I pick up on the question you asked before about the Australian Dream and the relevance of the title? In Australia, like Stan said, it's a settler culture now. Mm-hmm. But that means that a lot of people have come from elsewhere with a lot of stories and their own history, some of which they wanted to bring and some of which they wanted to leave behind. So they've been able to come to Australia, start again, reinvent themselves. And the whole time, we haven't adequately learnt the story of the people who actually own the place, you know, who'd been walking on this continent for 60,000 years. And also the relevance of sport, because sport is an arena that enables people to dream. Young kids look at people like Adam Goodes or Colin Kaepernick or LeBron James and they say, I want to be this. But they don't often understand the tensions and the politics and everything else that is going on around it. So that, you know, the fact that it's sold as a dream is sometimes just so wrong. You know, it's not a dream at all. It can be an absolute nightmare. And so when I hear the title of the film, The Australian Dream, there's all of these things playing into it.
Can you talk a little bit about the current state of international sport, racism? Where are we? How are we fighting it?
Oh my God, you know.
How long have you got?
Yeah, this is the next hour. I live with
know,
this
and
every
I'm getting
day.
a sign, but this is what this film does, is it makes you think about these things. If you could give me some top-line thoughts.
Look, when we flew in yesterday afternoon, and I went and met with a friend of mine who lives here. She's a Canadian cyclist, and I don't know how many of you know her. Her name is Kristen Worley. But she is absolutely phenomenal and, you know, like Adam, in so many ways, a hero of sport because they're changing sport. And the people that run sport, they don't want sport to be a showcase where people can highlight challenges and difficulties and issues that need confronting. They don't want that. They want the dream. But people that play sport, you know, most recently we saw the FIFA Women's World Cup and Megan Rapinoe from the USA team. I mean, just phenomenal. There are many people like that. And Adam is in exactly the same category, where if they can't do it in a sports arena, where is it going to be done? And sport is so good for that because athletes do stand up to the authority and they say, no, this sporting arena, this is where we're all supposed to feel safe. This is where we all have equality. This is where people can come with all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of religions, all sorts of races and languages and thoughts and beliefs, and we have to make one team, and we're playing together against that team. So if we do have these issues, let's sort it out now. Let's talk about it while we're all focused on this field, and we can talk about it because in too many other areas of life, we can't.
It's interesting as well, you know, the old adage that sport and politics don't mix, when in fact sport is politics. Sport is an incredible vehicle for nationalism. On the one hand, you have the veneer of one nation, one sporting team, but within that you have a history of race and politics and class. And I think, Adam, that's what you'd confronted, isn't it, in a sense? They would much rather that you had not said a word about any of this.
Well, I think the biggest thing for me was that I think I must have misread the situation. I think, you know, that Indigenous round, which is a round that we celebrate Indigenous people and culture, I was wearing an Indigenous themed jumper designed by my mum. I was wearing an Indigenous mouthguard. And in the second quarter, after kicking a goal during Indigenous round, as an Indigenous person, I did an Indigenous dance. And people didn't like that. And we had, you know, 4 non-Indigenous people sitting in the commentary box saying, oh, that's not good. I don't know what he's doing there. And it really did start another conversation of what's Adam Goodes up to again now? What's he trying to prove by doing that? Did I pick the wrong moment? I don't think so. But unfortunately, we had the wrong people commenting on the game that couldn't understand why an Indigenous person was doing an Indigenous dance during Indigenous round.
Because you have to be grateful. So we will have an Indigenous round, but please don't make an Indigenous political statement or an expression of overt Indigenous pride, because that may be difficult for some people to deal with.
First off, thank you. I think that was really courageous, and I'm a high school phys ed teacher, and I plan on using this in my curriculum. So thank you for that. When I was watching the film, it dawned on me when you scored your goal and you did the Indigenous dance, it was so beautiful. Where were your teammates in this? Was that talked about? It seemed to me like that would be a perfect opportunity, as in the Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, a show of solidarity for your group to do that.
Yeah, so I think, I spoke the night before with Lewis Jetta, who was another Indigenous teammate, leading into that game, and I said, Lewis, we've got to dance. It's Indigenous round. We want to inspire the other Indigenous players in the AFL that we should be dancing. If we score a goal, we should dance. And if we're going to dance, this is the right time to do it. And Lewis and I decided whoever scored the first goal, we're going to dance. And Lewis had an opportunity in the first quarter, and I was right behind him when he was going for that goal. And he kicked it, and whatever he was going to do, I was going to back him up. And he missed, unfortunately. So so it would have been completely different if he had to kick that goal. Jeez, we might not be here. But in the second quarter, when I kicked that goal, none of our other teammates who are non-Indigenous knew what we were doing. It just happened so perfectly because I believe everything happens for a reason. And I marked the ball right in front of the cheer squad of the opposition. They were just on my right-hand side. So when I kicked that ball and it was going through, I just made a beeline straight for them to do this dance. And it is a war cry, it's supposed to be something that you do at the start of a game. If you're a rugby fan, it's like the haka in the rugby, and it's a celebration of culture, but it's actually calling out to the opposition. You're coming onto our turf. This is going to be very confrontational, and unfortunately, a lot of people in that front row were scared of the imaginary spear that I threw.
The difference here is the haka is so celebrated.
It is. And I think since that moment, when I had the weekend off during the Adelaide game, when people stood up in the third quarter, Lewis Jetta actually kicked the first goal of that game, and he did a dance. And that was his way of saying to me, I've got your back, uncle, which was really nice. And since that, a lot more Indigenous boys are dancing. We just saw a young Swans player, a young Indigenous boy, in his first game. He kicked his first goal and he danced. And this is a young kid that's been on a long journey to get to the AFL. For him to be that courageous to do that was a really good celebration as well. So it's nice to know that these young kids are seeing what's happened in the past and getting that courage to take that.
Can I just say really quickly, you just said something I think that is an incredible observation. You said the haka is celebrated. And that goes to the heart of something that we have not yet dealt with in Australia. In New Zealand, the entire state of New Zealand was formed around the Treaty of Waitangi, a fundamental recognition of the place of Maori people and Maori culture in their society. When you arrive in New Zealand, they say, welcome to Aotearoa. When you watch television, you hear Maori language. You cannot separate Maori culture and Maori sovereignty from what it is to be a New Zealander. We are founded on the idea of terra nullius, empty land, where the rights of First Peoples were not recognised, and we have never signed treaties. They can celebrate because as a nation their sovereignty is founded in the place of First Peoples. When Adam does something like that, or when we speak up, or we raise these issues, we are striking at the very heart of the question of legitimacy in Australia. And I think that's what is so difficult to deal with, that question of the unresolved place of First Peoples and the settlement of Australia that has never truly placed First People and sovereignty at the heart of the nation. And that's the difference between New Zealand and Australia, and why they can celebrate the haka and why something like that can be seen as a provocative gesture.
What do you think is the next level for you? So now that it's being shown in America and dance and sport, what would be the next kind of level?
Yeah, I think the next level for me is we're not recognised in our constitution, but we were asked by our Prime Minister 2 Prime Ministers ago, now we change all the time, but he brought 200 of our Indigenous leaders to Uluru, Ayers Rock, to have a discussion on what is it that Indigenous people want right now. Is it sovereignty? Is it treaty? Have 3 days, come together and tell us what we want. And after that 3 days, very heated discussion. I wasn't there. Stan was there for a few days. A lot of our Indigenous leaders, put forward what they think it'll be best for our people. And that's very tough to do when you've got over 500 different nations coming together. And they came up with the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And this was a one-pager directed at the Australian people. And the Prime Minister looked at that document and said, "Nah, you're never going to get that." And in this document, all that we asked for is to have the Australian people vote on whether it is important or not on Indigenous people to have a voice to Parliament. And what that would give us is a seat at the table to give expert advice as Indigenous people on Indigenous issues. And it's unfortunate that it was another slap in the face for us as Indigenous people. So that's a real big cause for us at the moment in getting this off the ground in Australia and making sure that this document, this Uluru Statement of the Heart, is something all Australians learn about and actually becomes a bit of a movement so that we can get this voice to Parliament that we all agreed that we wanted. And hopefully through people watching the Australian Dream and learning a little bit more about Australian history in the last 240 odd years, it'll help us to get to that next level, because I know by having that elected voice to Parliament, that will make a huge difference.
I think also education.
Right.
Education is vital for the next generation and the generations coming after that. We had lived overseas for a long time, and we went back to Australia for a short period. And one of our sons, we enrolled him in the local school, and the teacher saw me after about 3 weeks, and she said, "Oh, is Jesse Indigenous?" And I said, "Yes, he is." And she said, "Oh, I wish you told me." And I said, "Why? Does it make any difference?" And she goes, "Yes, if we have Indigenous kids in the class, we have to teach a unit of Indigenous history."
Yes.
And I said, "Well, that's wasted because he knows his history." I told you I had a lot to say. And what's needed is for that history to be taught to everybody else when there's not Indigenous kids in the class. But he's just about to finish high school this year, and at one of their final assemblies, he was asked to give a welcome to country, which he did in his language. And it's the first time that school or anyone at that school had heard that language. And he's now been asked by a number of other schools to do it for their assemblies as well. So that's immediately had an impact on all of his year group. And you hope that starts to build. And again, it's a slow build that then it will take off, hopefully.
Please join me in congratulating this amazing team on a wonderful film. Thank you so much.